This podcast is not a source of legal advice. No two legal cases are the same. Contact an attorney if you require legal assistance. Welcome to the NJ Criminal Podcast, and part 2 in this series.
You just spoke a minute ago about social justice, and you teach a course in social justice. Talk to me a little bit about the different social justice issues associated with cannabis.
Sure. So the background is, and the reason why people even talk about social justice and cannabis, is that if you look at the history of prohibition, a lot of it is steeped in racism, frankly. And so back in about 1900, there was a large influx of Mexican Americans that were coming in because of the war and because of political instability. And when they came, they brought the tradition of smoking cannabis, because in the U.S. that really had not been the case before. Before that, we actually had compounders who were like early pharmacists, and they would actually make cannabis tinctures. And the tinctures are the drops or liquids that you put under your tongue. So back between about 1850 and roughly 1937, 1941, when cannabis was essentially banned because of a very high tax, you could actually go to your compounder and you could get cannabis tincture. So it was perfectly legal. It was used for many different conditions. Big pharmaceuticals like Brother Smith, Kilden, Eli Lilly, they all made cannabis tincture.
I never knew that. I never knew that.
So it was pretty interesting that, our grandparents, great-grandparents were using cannabis all this time. And then as soon as Mexicans came across the border and were smoking, all of a sudden a big campaign led by a bureaucrat, Harry Anslinger, who handled alcohol prohibition too, he really targeted people of color. So Mexican Americans and also, quote, jazz musicians, aka blacks. And he started to connect cannabis with things like being a gateway drug, making people crazy, just making people dangerous. And so he got people to buy into that, and eventually cannabis was banned that way.
Yeah, they had all that propaganda. I do remember that, the propaganda pieces. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, a whole machine. And if you read some of the early headlines, it's just crazy about some of the stories that they'll report. So at any rate, after that happened, we also found that a lot of people of color were getting arrested at much greater rates than whites, even though use was similar. So ACLU did a very seminal study, and it showed that 3.64 times brown and black people were getting arrested as whites. So it definitely was unequal treatment. And when that happened, of course, you had families that were broken up, communities broken up, people ending up in prison. And so it's a very long preface to say that's why we're concerned about social justice, because we want to give people who were harmed by the war on drugs, who were largely brown and black people, a stake in the cannabis industry if that's what they want. So it's trying to make reparations for what those families have gone through.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it was part and parcel of Nixon's war on crime that led it to be scheduled as a Schedule 1.
Exactly
along with heroin, right?
Yep, exactly right. So yes, cannabis is still considered a Schedule 1 drug, along with heroin, LSD, peyote, and it's defined as being very addictive and having no medical use.
Right.
No accepted medical use, which we know is just absolutely false and ridiculous. But yes, here we are stuck with a Schedule 1 designation.
Right. But how do we navigate that stigma behind cannabis, since it's still classified federally as a Schedule 1 controlled dangerous substance?
Yeah,
that's the issue,
part
right?
of it. Yeah. Part of it is the normalization. Part of it is making sure that we have a safe industry and that people have the facts around cannabis. But I do think that some of the things that will change people's hearts and minds is when they see the medical applications. So, for example, in a lot of states, their medical cannabis program started because a parent stood up for their child, and the child had epilepsy in many cases, and so the parent wanted to give them cannabis instead of all the regular pharma that they were on. So you do have those kind of cases where people have stood up for their children. You also have cannabis patients and their loved ones who also stand up for them, because cannabis can be very effective, again, with pain relief, helping nausea, stimulating appetite. And then also you have CBD, which does not get people high. And it's been very popular, especially in an older population where people have aches and pains. muscles, joints, arthritis, things like that. So I think that when people see how effective cannabis can be as a medicine, that at least starts the conversation, starts to change a few hearts and minds. And then when they come to understand the prohibitionist history, then we see how important it is to try to include people who have been hurt by the war on drugs.
Yeah, I always think it's so important, really, in any topic, but this topic specifically, to understand about the history, as you've described it, behind how it became illegal, and the path now back towards legalization, and why those social issues, can't be understated or over discussed, in my opinion.
Yeah, they're so connected. And if you even look at the way that the United States started in legalizing the medical cannabis market, it was in California. And it was because of some brave people like Dennis Perrone and Brownie Mary, who actually made infused brownies and gave it to HIV and AIDS patients. So when HIV and AIDS really started to flaring up in the late 80s and then trickling into the 90s, you did have a lot of people who knew cannabis would help on a medical basis. And so they're the ones that really started trying to support the medical cannabis program. And in 1996, California was the first state to legalize medical cannabis, and that really started everything. But again, it was because of health and because of HIV/AIDS.
Right. And, obviously alcohol is legal, but there are so many dangers associated with alcohol use and abuse. You don't ever really hear of anyone overdosing on marijuana or cannabis. But there are some certain dangers, I guess, that would have to be at least acknowledged in terms of, using it and driving. When you teach, do you teach about the benefits and the harms of usage?
I do. We have a section that's called social issues, and so we do go through things like the argument about gateway drug. We do talk about underage use. We talk about driving while impaired. But that also is kind of a complicated issue for a couple reasons. One is that we've relied pretty much on blood or urine tests with cannabis. And if you're a regular smoker or user of cannabis, you can actually stop right now, and in 30 days you could be tested, and there's a good chance you would still test positive because
Right.
your body just stores it for that long, even though you would absolutely not be impaired at all. So
Right.
testing for impairment is definitely going to be something we'll see, and at some point we might have something like a cannabis breathalyzer. But the tricky part about cannabis is the only way you know somebody's actively impaired is you pretty much have to scan their brain. You can't really get it from other sources. So you can imagine at some point maybe we'll have some sort of app that can do that. But that is a huge challenge. And then
Yeah.
also, and also people have such different tolerance levels too. I know an MS patient in Colorado, and she regularly will take well over 200 milligrams of cannabis at a sitting and a couple times per day. Whereas for most of us, that would be a dose that would probably make you fall asleep, or definitely would have some uncomfortable effects. But she is so attuned to it, she gets along just fine. So again, trying to set up a threshold of what somebody would be to be impaired while they're driving, that's also a very difficult question.
Right. That's something that I'm interested in exploring with someone, either a toxicologist or a pharmacologist. And I'm certainly not an expert. My general understanding is that you can test for the active metabolite, but you may be able to correct me if I'm wrong. There is obviously, and I don't want to get too far afield, but there is a case pending right now, State versus Olenosky, which is challenging drug recognition experts in New Jersey. And I think that's going to be a huge issue for prosecutors and defense attorneys dealing with individuals who are accused of driving under the influence, particularly if there's an accident involving death or serious bodily injury.
Yes.
Being able to establish whether or not that person was impaired is a huge, I think, issue going forward. And I have seen different apps that people are developing, or breathalyzers. I mean, are you able to speak to that at all? I mean, that's something that I was really searching to talk to somebody specifically about, but I don't know if you can comment on that or not.
Well, the Olenosky case, first of all, is crucial. And Judge Lisa, who's going through, I'm sure, hundreds of pages of documents, has a very important decision that will be coming down. And that will not only affect DREs for police departments, but also for employers. At some point, there is supposed to be a program for what they call WIRE experts, WIRE, workplace impairment recognition experts. And so apparently, if I'm running a business and I think someone's impaired, I can call in, or I might have on staff, if I have a big enough company, a WIRE expert to tell me whether that person actually is actively impaired on the job. So you can imagine that if the Olenowski case gets decided in a certain way, what do you do about the WIRE experts now? Because they depend on much of the same protocol that the DREs do. So
I imagine they'll be challenged. I imagine somebody will challenge them.
And there are a couple companies that are trying to develop breathalyzers. There's a company in San Francisco called Hound Technology, and they do have a big waiting list on people who want to try their product.
What's the name of that again? Howland?
It's called Hound, Hound.
Oh, Hound.
Like a dog.
Got it.
Yeah, Hound Technologies. But the issue with that again is it can detect whether you've actively consumed cannabis. It has like a bell-shaped curve that will tell you where you are from 0 to about 3 hours. So it'll tell you if you're actively, quote, impaired. But then the issue again is the level of impairment. So the state of Colorado and Oregon both have levels of impairment. But again, each person's physiology is so different that someone may well be impaired at a certain level and someone else will be totally fine.
Right. Well, that's the same with alcohol, though, right?
A little bit. I mean, if you drink alcohol, at some point you're going to be impaired,
right?
Or partially impaired. But again, for some people with the huge tolerance and everything else, I would not call them impaired.
Right. But they're BAC, and they could be walking around with a BAC if it's over the legal limit. Yeah. So there's just so many issues there. I think that's something that's going to have to be navigated and hopefully a decision as to how to measure that. I mean, we don't want people driving around impaired.
Right. And I do think in the short term, one smart thing would be for places like consumption lounges. So consumption lounges can be developed in conjunction with a dispensary. If you have a dispensary license, you can apply for a consumption lounge license. And what that is, a consumption lounge either has to be located in the same building but with a separate door, or on the same grounds. So you might walk outside and walk 25 feet to the lounge. And the lounge has to be a separate building with ventilation. It can't be visible from the street, and that's where people can consume product.
It can or cannot be visible from the street. Cannot
be visible from the street.
So is this like the places in Amsterdam type things?
Yes, I would call it like an Amsterdam experience, but more discreet.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, because you can walk by the windows in Amsterdam and look right in and see people having their little space cakes or smoking their cannabis.
Right.
But you would not do that in New Jersey. You would just see a building, and it may well have blacked out windows and that sort of thing. But at any rate, so you can go in the dispensary, buy product, and then go into the consumption lounge and consume, and then go on your way. I would think if I were going to put up a consumption lounge, I would absolutely make a deal with Uber or something else, or have a bus so that no one ever drove out of my establishment.
Well, right. I mean, you can imagine the insurance on that.
Yeah, the insurance and also the public perception, even though we see people going to bars and restaurants every day and then getting in their cars and driving off. But we have a ways to go before we have any kind of normalization to the degree that alcohol is.
Yeah. To date, what is your thoughts, or what are your thoughts on how the state is doing on, prioritizing the application process, promoting, inclusion of diverse populations, etc.? Or is there anyone that you could recommend that I speak to about that?
For the most part, I'm very happy with the progress they've made. The New Jersey Cannabis Regulatory Commission is the body I'm speaking about. The one thing that I do like to point out to people is that when the New Jersey Cannabis Regulatory Commission started their mission of setting up a safe and equitable business, they also inherited such a small medical cannabis market. I mean, even today, we only have 16 dispensaries that are open for adult use, and a total of I think it's 23 for all the medical patients, and we have a population of 9.2 million. So we started from such a small baseline of cannabis businesses that it's taken us a while, but I can understand why, to get where we are now, where the majority of applicants that are applying are social equity applicants. We have, and they're being processed. There's about over 1,000 that have been submitted. So I love to see that kind of progress. I'm glad to see people are pursuing micro licenses too, so we have small operators. But again, the way the New Jersey market was set up, we were set up pretty much with entirely by MSOs, multi-state operators, all the big cannabis businesses. So it looks like we kind of have an oligopoly of cannabis businesses now, but my hope is that in about 9 months to a year, when some of the first applicants get out there who are social equity applicants, that our landscape is going to look very different. And that's the part that I'm most excited about.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned. There is more to come. If you're interested in starting a podcast, visit the contact page at njcriminalpodcast.com and send Meg a message. She'd love to discuss your legal podcast.